Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. Hello, everyone. Today, we'll be talking about the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and I'm here talking with Mark Suroviec. Hello, Mark. I'm so excited that you're excited about this book.
I'm thrilled. I'm super excited about this. I'm super excited about this book. I can't talk, and it's going to be great.
Yes. Yeah. Awesome. Will you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do? Just, the 10-second bio, whatever. Do whatever you want. But yeah, okay. Tell us about you.
My name is Mark Suroviec. I am the founder and owner of Workplace Solutions. So we are a small business dedicated to the idea that life is too short for work to suck. So we create catalytic events and trainings that help people build, manage, and train their team.
Fantastic. And we met in a space that is sort of dedicated to experiential education and growth and learning, which is super fun. And it came across somehow in some conversation we had that you like this book and I like this book. That's great. What brought you to this book in the first place, or how did you find it, or what caught your eye about it?
I was actually in another conference we had put on with my previous employer. We had put on a small open space style conference for some of our international partners. And one of the gentlemen, I think he was from Uganda, said, "This is the best book ever." And I'm like, okay, I was unfamiliar with the book and I decided to read. And some of my enthusiasm for the book has to do with the time period in which I read it. So I read it the first time during the heart of the pandemic. And so there's obviously a lot of emotion with that. But it really helped me understand a lot of the things that were going on in the world. So I was, so I think this, and I can talk more about that later, but
we'll get to that.
I absolutely love this book. It's one of the two books that I think about the most in terms of how I run my own business. So this and The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath.
Oh, yeah. We've talked about that a tiny bit, too, in other times. Too. That's another great book, for sure. I have an episode on that book. If folks want to, promote myself on myself, go find that one. Power of Moments. Pretty good. Pretty good time. So this book, it actually came out in 2013. So it's not, shockingly brand new. But I think it launched Daniel Kahneman to getting a Nobel Prize down the road. This is a really... a lot of research, a lot of thought, but also very readable. So I don't want people to start off being like, oh my gosh, Nobel Prize, neuroscience, brains. It's actually a really readable and an engaging book, and he does a great job of telling stories to sort of move these little pieces along and giving tons of examples. So although we're going to probably talk about, I'm sure, some science and other things, the book is still very readable. Don't forget about that. So you read during the pandemic. I read this book probably in the mid 2015, 16. So it had been out for a little bit, but a while ago. And I still think about it all the time. And it really, I think, changes how I approach interacting with people in different ways. And a lot of the concepts that Kahneman talks about, you then see later, right? He talks about them, then later you're like, oh, there's a bias. Oh, there's that thing happening. Oh, there's system 1 or system 2. So when you said this came up a lot for you during the pandemic and the emotions attached to it, tell me about how emotions attach to the ideas in this book for you.
For one, I found myself just being absolutely excited every time I would learn something new in this book. I just had mind-blowing day after day, and I would come into the next Zoom meeting and be like, you guys will not believe this. What
were some of those things? What were some of those mind-blowing things for you that you were just had to blabber on about? Because I was similar, I think.
There were so many. I've forgotten over half of them, so I'm actually rereading the book right now. But some that really stick out were when he talked about the difference in statistics for death rate versus survivor rate and how that information was presented. So when caveat, I read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking with Strangers, right after this. So if I accidentally reference something in that book that's not in this book,
great.
If you can't find it in here, it's in that other book.
Perfect.
But,
no worries. No worries.
But the idea that a doctor would make a different medical decision based on if they were presented with the information of it's a 90% survival rate versus a 10% mortality rate. And that actually making different decisions based on that. And these are people who go to school for a very long time to get their expertise. And just that one detail changes their behavior. And so for me, that was in the beginning of the pandemic, and I don't want to get into the political side of that, but that idea of that original conflict between is this a big deal or not? You had the one group of people saying, well, look, 99% of the people survive, and the other group of people saying, look at these hundreds of thousands of people that are dying. And it finally made sense. Like, both groups of people are intelligent and they're just focused on that detail. And so when you say, oh yeah, 99% of people survive, doesn't sound like as big of a deal as it is. And you say, well, 1 million people have died. Well, okay, that is a really big deal. So, but it really helped me understand how very intelligent people could come to very different conclusions during that season where nobody really knew kind of what was going on.
Yeah. And I think it speaks a little bit to one of the biases that Kahneman talks about, which is the what you see is all there is bias. And so we see a small slice of things sometimes, and we're like, that's it. That's all there is. That's the part I see is the part I recognize. And there isn't even anything else beyond that. That's just what there is. And that's like data is like a pretty good, small scale example of this. If I only see data for like this sort of classic example, like all swans are white. I've only ever seen white swans. What I see is a white swan. That's all there is. And someone's like, P.S. by the way, in Australia, they have swans that are black, and your brain explodes. You're like, there's no data for that. That doesn't exist. It's not even a thing. We can't handle that. It's not that we can't handle it. But our brain has to work very differently to take in information that we didn't even conceive of before. And I think this is sort of the title of the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about these two brain systems. And so we have a fast thinking brain system that's looking for patterns, making leaps, intuitive, kind of jumping through things. And we have the slow thinking version where we have to basically downshift a little bit in our brain and really do difficult cognitive work. And we don't have the energy. It takes a lot of energy to do really difficult cognitive work. Like, we're suddenly driving uphill in the mud, wheels are spinning, stuff is happening, we're barely making progress. Our brain is working that hard versus we're going down a water slide. We're like, woo! Like, we've hit the pool at the bottom, because that other system, our brain works so quickly and we don't always recognize it. They both have their pluses and minuses. Like, when we go really fast, sometimes we miss things. And because we're making these leaps, we're looking for patterns. We're like, cool, everything fits this pattern, we're done. We don't necessarily notice the outliers or other parts of these things. And our brains it's easy and we like it. We like it and it's easy and we recognize a pattern. We're like, ding, we got it. And so we feel really good about ourselves sometimes, but we miss things. And hard work is hard on the flip side, and we wimp out and stop working hard sometimes. So we don't always get to that conclusion at the end.
Yeah, I was surprised by how often we think we're operating in system 2 when we're really operating in system 1. And I do wish he had different terms for that. I get system 1 and system 2 mixed up. Like, yeah, that's for a person that focuses on memory. I was very surprised that was his choices. But
yeah, that's it. Like, they're not very fancy. The names are not at all fancy.
But yeah, that idea of, I think I'm making a rational choice, but I'm actually affected far more by some of these biases or some of these heuristics.
Yeah.
And or the chapter where he talked about replacing an easier question with a harder question, replacing a harder question with an easier question. So is this company worth investing in? That's a hard question to ask. That's all the business data that's involved. do I like this brand? That's an easy question to answer. And then you substitute that. Same thing with a political candidate. Do I like this candidate is different than will this person actually be effective and competent? So,
right. Tough question, right?
Yeah.
And that's a great point that we like it to be easy and we make it easy on ourselves. And he really talks about the physiology of like your brain is burning a lot of energy. And so we can't always make great choices. We can't always operate in that much more logical, deep thinking way. And nor do we always have to, but we sometimes don't even have the energy for it. We're just like tapped out. Like I don't have the glucose in my brain to think very deeply right now. And I think some of that, obviously we don't always keep track of it. Sometimes people are like, oh, I'm really hungry right now. Like we can recognize when we're hungry or thirsty or, stress in other ways. But I think we don't really get into how much that affects our thinking because we like on the inside, we think we're doing a great job. Like, oh yeah, my brain just figured this out. I'm amazing. And you're like, okay, thanks. Look, who's telling you this? It's your brain, right?
Yeah.
Are there other parts from this book that were really like caught your attention as you were reading through?
I think a couple things, the idea about anchors. So I really was fascinated by the chapter on anchors, where even anchors that were outrageous. I think he mentioned if you was Gandhi less than or older than 155 when he died, and that if you gave that as an anchor, that actually pulled up your estimate of how old he was when he died versus not giving that anchor or giving a lower anchor. And I think practically just he gave several examples where you were influenced by things like, was there money on the screensaver in the experimental condition? And just like I want to rail against that idea of like, I'm not affected by that. And it's like, like I'm not the one who would be affected by that. And yet we are. And I think that's the both scary thing of what if some of these things are used for evil versus good? Right. So I see just, I have a fear there, but also just an understanding of how those anchoring principles come out. And because I know as a small business owner who is responsible for setting my own prices, I have to think about some of those concepts, and I don't want to manipulate people. I want to, but knowing kind of what your starting point is affects where you're going.
Right.
So,
well, and you still want to be anchored to like quality, right?
Yeah.
And not necessarily like, and so dollars equal quality. So then you have to like do some weird math in there and your brain has to come up with something. And and you have to speak that in a way that other people understand. I think one of the other parts I liked about this book was when he talked about evaluating Kahneman worked for the Israeli military system for a while. And he talks about how you decide who's going to be an officer and who's not. And so he was sort of in charge of this officer training program where you decide if people go on to continue in leadership roles or if they don't. And my world is the world of leadership. So this, is very interesting to me. But how you decide can be very statistical, right? You can look at, well, they scored this on this test and they could run this fast and they could do this thing and they could do this on this other metric, and it was really important to also look at how you feel about the person, right? Do I feel like they'd be a good leader? Do I think they'd be great? And I think he skewed them from, at one point, they were only this sort of feeling space of like, well, they seem good. Oh, they look great. And so, which led into a whole bunch of other biases because we're biased toward people who resemble ourselves or who we resonate with in ways that are actually mirroring our own ideas, our own perspectives, our own selves in different ways. So we lose, when we just go with who we like, we lose some objectivity, obviously. And when we go to only the stats, it seems really cold and distant, and it doesn't quite get to the heart of if we think someone's good or not, because there's so many intangible pieces. Like leadership there's a lot of intangibles there. So he sort of helped them develop this system where you do metrics, you do tests, you do studies, you see what's happening, you look at this and you look at that. And then he said he went back to visit later and he's like, oh yeah, how are you doing? How's this going? And he's like, well, the people are like, well, we do these tests, we do this. And then we sit back and we close our eyes and we think, how do I feel about this, seeing this person as the leader in the future? Like, do I get a good feeling or not? Like they just sit there and it's like actually a part of the process to the how you feel about this person from the evaluator's perspective, which I thought was great. This mix of the very rational, like quantitative and qualitative blended together.
Yeah, I think one thing that surprised me from the book, I keep saying one thing, there was like hundreds of things.
Exactly.
You could probably do 6 episodes on this book easy. It's that full. It's that full. Was when he referenced the statistics with the judges and
right?
their length of sentence was most influenced by the proximity of the last time they had a meal.
Yes.
Which is just mind-blowing considering all of the social justice conversation and those kind of things to say just get that guy some Doritos,
Right. And it was like obvious. It wasn't just like, oh, skewed a little bit. It was blatantly like, yeah, the people whose case was heard right before lunch got way harsher sentences. Like they're just like, we're done with you, get out of here. Then people who were right after lunch, like if you compare like the 11 o'clock versus like the 1 o'clock sessions, or whatever it was, with noon being the lunch hour, I think it was drastically different from one to the other. I think though, and this has affected my life a little bit, he also talks about doctors and people in medical professions similarly doing better, more thorough assessments earlier in the day. And as they get tired later in the day, not necessarily worse outcomes, well, slightly worse outcomes, but like less time, less patience, some of these more brain intensive things like judgment, assessment, looking at that. So I try always to schedule my medical appointments as early in the day as possible from here on out. Cause I'm like, I would rather have that 8 a.m. appointment and bust my butt to get up there early than roll in at 4:30 when they're right about to clock out for the day. I mean, we feel that, we know that in ourselves, like, oh yeah, it's the end of the day. I'm not going to engage anything too tough or too hard, but nor do I want my doctor in that position to sort of be winging it at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's almost like we sometimes forget that people who are operating in a professional capacity are people too.
What?
I know, crazy. But when they're doing the service, it's like, well, hey, they're still on the clock. They should be at full capacity. And they're people. They get tired. They need food. It shouldn't surprise us. But so many folks kind of muscle through that and power through that and don't let their guard down, that it's like, oh, they actually are really tired and their decision making might be not suspect, but affected.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Definitely affected. Definitely. Yeah. Affected in some ways. Is there another part that like comes to mind? Another light bulb moment from this book for you?
I got a lot of insight into project management and project planning from some of the expectations. So here, Kahneman shares what they expected as far as how long it would take to write the book.
Oh, and that's hilarious. That's so funny.
Who is an expert in this, still dramatically underestimated how long the process would take. And I think, I forget exactly how he says it, but the lesson for me was people are by default plan for the best case scenario. And I was involved in a project that went that way, where the leadership had basically said, oh yeah, it's going to take us like 2 weeks, and it didn't.
Right.
And it's just like, I think for me, when I think about when I'm planning a project, what things can go wrong, where are the potential delays, almost assuming that, I read somewhere, I think it was Microsoft automatically adds 20 or 25% to all of their internal project timelines, just knowing that that's a truth. And they just said across the board policy, write it up. And then we're off the bat, we're going to put like a 25% buffer on there because things don't go according to plan. There's delays, there's life gets in the way. Right now we're obviously dealing with supply chain things.
Sure.
Hopefully when folks listen to this episode 30 years in the future, that's done.
Like, what is that? We fix that.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
well, yeah.
But that idea of applying that to project planning, and it's going to take longer than you expect. You've got the best case scenario. And one of the things I really appreciate about the book is at the end of each chapter, when he gave examples of questions of how to deal with some of those heuristics and biases, gave very specific examples of saying, ask this question in that context. And I'm struggling to recall some of those at the moment, but I thought that was super helpul.
Yeah. Or he gives like a little like scenario of like, here's what this looks like in action kind of thing. A little bit, one or the other. He speaking of like how long it takes to write the book, the story was hilarious because he and two other people were writing a book together. There were three of them, and they're like, oh, how long should this take? And one person's like, oh, this is going to take 6 months. And the other person's like, this is going to take a year. And he's like, well, how good are people at guessing how long this will take when they work together? And he got into the research a little bit, and he's poking around, and he's like, oh, people underestimate by like 50% often. So Microsoft's 25% is nice. So they think that they're doing a good job. And then he found that like a certain percentage actually never finish at all. Like whatever was like 20% are like takes twice as long as they estimate. And then some other percent, like 10%, just never get done ever. And he's like, whoa. So we might be off by hundreds of percent, like we might be 200% off in this, or we might never get done, which I'm like, oh yeah, it's good to know. And that you can look into these things and think about how, we're making guesses, we're estimating. And I think he talks a little bit also about how we plan for our future self to be better than our current self in a lot of ways. So our future self is like, oh yeah, my future self is going to be able to follow that project, no problem. There's not going to be like just exactly what you were saying. There's not going to be hiccups along the way. Future self has got that nailed. Current self is like, is going to be future self someday. So no problems. Like we're actually only ever our current self. The problems happen constantly. Yeah. We get screwed up all over the place.
Yeah. Current self called in sick yesterday.
Yeah. Oh, weird. How does this even happen? Yeah. I think you're right. There's so many interesting points of this book in terms of how I hadn't been thinking of that project management part for a while, but we do a terrible job of estimating how long our work will take, especially when we work with others, right? And how we are doing other things. Another part that I liked was when he talks about giving feedback to people, and like he did the math. Negative feedback doesn't work. Like it doesn't encourage growth and progress to tell someone what they're doing wrong all the time without also telling them some of the things that they do right. Like we sort of know this and we hear this, like, yeah, don't forget to support people. And I think there are spaces where that doesn't land, people don't believe that you can give people positive feedback. It will function or work, or, we'll just make them soft and they'll never do the work. The stats are not in your favor, people, if that's you, because giving only critical feedback, only constructive feedback exclusively demoralizes people. We know this. There's math, there's science, there's brain science to it. Thanks, Kahneman. And you perform worse over time if you are only getting this sort of, here's what you did wrong, here's what you did wrong, here's what you did wrong type of feedback.
Yeah. I enjoyed the chapter on availability bias, where what we recall influences us much more than we think it does. So we don't necessarily think of the statistics of something, how prevalent it is. It's more, can I think of an example of this in action, and how much that affects our decision-making, how much that affects public policy. So whatever the squeaky wheel is gets the grease, whether or not that's truly the biggest threat or priority, it becomes that because it's fresh in your mind.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said for group processes, right? When the group we see a group working together, and the last thing that they talk about suddenly becomes a plan for the next thing. Even, they spend 5 minutes talking about this and that and this and that. Then suddenly the thing that happens in the last 2 minutes, 30 seconds of the conversation is suddenly really present in terms of whatever happens next. The last piece is overly influential in future plans often, which is interesting. And it sort of sets us up for ways to work around that, right? To keep track along the way, to, get a sense of, oh, this thing is really important, we'll come back to it, and then come back to it. Or, I think we want to, sometimes we're both in a space where we want to generate a lot of ideas or a lot of options and then find the best one. So if you're doing that process of generating a lot of options, whatever you generate first gets lost. Even if it is like the first couple are like really great, and we're like, no, generate more. Then you're like, whatever this like bottom of the barrel last thing you can possibly think of suddenly gets more weight because it was generated last in the process.
So I think something super practical I picked up from the book, I think early on, he mentions how something that's not true still affects you, even unless your system 2 actively says that is not true. And you've taken that mental effort to declare that that's not true. And it just made me wonder, and that's especially if you're tired. So you talked earlier about that lack of energy. So if your brain is engaged in something else, or you are just generally tired, scrolling through, Facebook and Instagram might not be the best application. And it's almost more insidious in that, that if I'm up late scrolling through Facebook, that is not a place that is known for accuracy of information.
Right.
So those things can still influence me if I'm not actively saying no, stopping at each post saying that is true or not true. And that's, no one actually does that when they're scrolling through their feed. So it makes me just really think about some of the behaviors or habits that I may have to say, all right, if I'm tired, I should not be scrolling through something where it can influence me, because it's going to affect me more than I think it does. And I think it's both scary, but something that I can actively do to say, I'm not going to put myself in that compromised situation, even though in the moment it doesn't feel like you're compromised.
Oh yeah. I think one of the themes throughout this whole book is on the inside, we always think everything is great. And in the reality, we're getting affected a lot more than we anticipate or than we expect, I suppose, down the road. Because we're like, oh yeah, no, I'm a sharp person. I can tell what's a lie and what's not a lie or whatever. But even that, yeah, I love that example of just sort of scrolling through and seeing headlines, seeing, blurbs, seeing like short little pieces of information, often out of context, often, in sort of skewed lights in different ways, I think some of that does affect, I don't even think. We know that affects us more than we think, because we are in that place of being not on our guard. And system 2, that deep thought, it takes a ton of energy. And of course, we're not set up for using our energy very well when we're fatigued at the end of the day, that late day system. It's interesting. I think I like how you're talking about that. It applies then to how you choose, what you do and when you do it, based on your energy level. And I think people often are just consuming at the end of the day, like, oh, I'm going to watch a movie, I'm going to binge a show, I'm going to do blah, blah, blah. But I think some of the other interesting point you make about what information I'm going to set myself to intake at that time is also pretty critical in terms of how that's going to influence me down the road. What
about you, Iggy? What are some of the things that jumped out at you?
I've been blabbering along the way. I think just the idea of these two systems. Oh, I love the part where they're trying to figure out how these systems and what you can see, and if they're physiological or if they're just mental, whatever. And so they have a camera looking at people's eyes, and you can see how the eyes dilate or contract based on how much, when our eyes are, I think it was dilated more. I might be getting this wrong. We're taking in more information. Like literally our eyes are a little bit wider open. We're getting more information in. Our brain's working harder. We're processing a lot. And so then when we stop taking that much information in, our eyes contract a little bit. Like our irises actually contract a tiny bit. So we are literally taking in less information and light, into our eyeballs. And our brain is processing a little bit less. And so they could put the camera on people's face and look at them and ask them these difficult questions. And not crazy difficult, but complicated math. Like, oh, what's 2 times 2? And people got that easy one. Then they're like, what's 24 times 17? Suddenly their brain is like, oh, and they could see them trying to work it out. And then they could see their eyes contract when they knew they could visually see that people had given up on that deep thinking before the person said, I don't know. I can't quite get that one. Or, whatever it is, like people step out. So step away from that. And so we could see physiologically that what system people were engaged in. And we're not always going to look at people's irises and see like, wait, are they dilated or contracted right now? Like, can we see that? But I thought that was fascinating that there are other physiological responses to what thinking system we're using at any given time.
And that was really exciting as a facilitator and trainer to put actual physiological evidence to that feeling you get, like, it looks like they're thinking. I don't know why. It looks like they're processing, because one of a good facilitator in our industry is comfortable with silence, and good trainers are comfortable with silence. And the expectation there is that during that silence, there's processing going on. They're not just, thinking, when is this garbage going to be over? It was, you hope.
Right.
But it was nice to see that was there's real things that your senses are picking up on. And I'm not saying that facilitators are like the mentalist where we can, see a fold on the collar and know everything about them. But there is that eye response is a real thing that you notice, whether you're noticing it consciously or not. And prior to that, I didn't have a way of describing even like, I can tell they're still thinking. At least I believe they're still thinking. And I think I'm right a lot of the time, but you're picking up that movement of the eyes is just one of the subtle signals. So,
yeah. And I think we process some of those subconsciously as people who work in the space of, we work in the space of wondering are people thinking, are they working on it, or are they not? Or are they just sitting there? Right. And in educational spaces too, you learn to read those signals in a much more subtle way. And I think some of this book also, like those, you can move things from system 2 of me examining your eyeball response to, okay, I see this pattern, right? I see this pattern in you when I ask a question, when the group is doing this thing, when this type of thing is happening. Here's what I kind of expect. Are things fitting into this pattern I expect? Can I tell from you, as a person that I've known for a while, can I see the signals that you're still thinking, or that you're done thinking, that you're engaging, or that you're disengaging? So I think you can move some of these things from this like deeper thought realm to a much like pattern-based, heuristic-based, like, oh, I have my shortcuts now. I don't have to think about it so much. And so you can transfer things, situations, pieces of knowledge, systems from one to the other, which I think is also really fascinating.
I think the last thing for me that I really focused on was that hindsight bias. So and I think most people are probably familiar with that idea of, it's you seem much more confident about the past after it's happened, but you see the implications of that all the time, where successful CEOs get these big packages of compensation, and it's like, well, maybe they were just lucky.
Yeah. Right.
Golly, in my line of work, I see a lot of teams or organizations that succeed in spite of the leader.
Right.
But the leader gets the credit, and it's like, oh man, they are and just because the outcome was good doesn't mean the process was good is one of my big things. Because if you're successful but you ground people to dust on the way there, then
Well, I think there's I've been adjacent to that idea, and not quite from this book, like over time, you see that wear on people, right? I think that's what tying it back into the book, like if you're only giving this sort of do better, like you're only this sort of driving personality or critical feedback, and then you're like, look, everyone was successful because I told them to do the better thing all the time, and everyone's like, that leader is such a jerk, and I hate them, and I don't want to spend any time with them. Eventually, over time, I think that evens out, because the most talented people will leave. So you'll see. Like you can see short-term successes, and you can see, oh, if I, really like yell at you a lot and put a lot of pressure on you and then you rise to the occasion, that works very short term. And then over time, people are like, I actually don't want to live in this level of pressure, this level of, scrutiny, this level of being driven constantly. So I'm going to change. I'm going to make a change to somewhere else, something else, whatever. So I would be curious to see those when the company is succeeding despite the leadership, what happens over time, right? Like short-term gains, whatever, like a little peak, but what happens with the staff, the people, the collective knowledge, the ability for growth long-term? Like how much is that hampered by this sort of short-term spike in productivity? Good stuff. So many interesting things. I feel like similarly, there are like 4,000 other topics from this book that are so great.
Yeah, that was the list of all the ones that I specifically had to talk about, but I could probably talk about this book for days.
Yeah.
So
it's so good. I guess we should finish talking someday about this or finish this conversation. I'm sure maybe we'll have more. But I love this. I think book actually really introduced me to the idea of cognitive dissonance in a really meaningful way, that we sort of see things and want to do things in a way that's easy for ourselves. But when we act counter to what we think, how we think we should be acting, for example, our brain struggles and we get in this sort of state of tension. And in the very first beginning of this chapter, there's this sort of, he talks sort of about, what are they called? The sort of putting our brain in a state of conflict. And so we have a list of things. I don't know if you've seen these before. And it'll say the word left or right, but they'll be on either the left or right side. So you have to say which side the word's on, but you'll see the word right, but it'll be on the left side, for example, at times. So you're trying to read through this list quickly and say left or right based on where the word is physically located, but not what the word itself says. And our brain wants to read what the word says. And so we're like, wait, no, that's on the left, but it says right. And then this one, so we put ourselves in a state of struggle. And that's like an example of cognitive dissonance, that we're not doing what we think. Part of our brain thinks I'm reading a word, and part of our brain thinks I'm looking at a space. And so they conflict, and we have that sort of internal conflict. And I think this idea of we avoid cognitive dissonance in some ways, but we also tell ourselves a lot of stories to make cognitive dissonance okay for ourselves. And so that rationalization of the dissonant situations we put ourselves in was another part of this book that came up for me a few times in different ways. Because I think we see people making bad choices, whatever that means, but then they can rationalize them later and be like, well, this was because of this. And that, again, that hindsight bias, like, well, this was a great idea because look at this amazing outcome, or, something else. But in reality, it's a really dissonant decision. People who say, oh, I'm a really honest person, but then they're like, wait, but you're telling some lies over here. Like, that's okay. Like, how do you rectify these things and put them together? So dissonance, I think, that idea of conflict, internal conflict, was really a fascinating part of this book for me.
I was just thinking about going back to that idea of anchoring, how that plays out in inflated job titles. So when someone has an exaggerated job title, they're the director of something or the vice president of something. Like, there's only 3 people in your company. You're not a vice president.
Right.
But how that plays out over a career, you get a bunch. If it only takes one inflated job title to apply for other jobs of that caliber, and it turns out that there's actually this incentive to inflate the job title, because now an inflated job title gives you opportunities that you wouldn't have had without that title, because it matters much more than we think it does. So,
yeah.
And if you've ever met someone that is in a role because they had a inflated title and just kept getting inflated roles, you're just like, oh man.
Yeah. That's unfortunate for everyone who has to work with you. That's too bad. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we should, I guess, wrap this up a little bit. Any last thoughts or final takeaways or things that I know you got your list. You're so organized. I really appreciate that. Good job. Any other pieces of this book that you're like, oh yeah, or things that you use most often from the book?
I would say what you see is all there is. So if you remember one phrase from the book, what you see is all there is a that's not a good thing. So, so just remembering there often are other options. There often are things to consider that aren't in front of you. So when you slow down and take that time, there may be possibilities that you are able to access, because what you see is not all there is.
Oh, that's so great. Such a great point. Thanks so much, Mark, for coming onto the podcast today and chatting with me. It's been a fun talking with you. I've had a good time.
Same here. Thanks, Iggy.
You bet. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education-related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.